Let's start by talking about one of my favorite cities in the world. If you've ever had a chance to travel in Europe, I hope you've had a chance to go to Vienna, Austria, because Vienna is a beautiful city with a long history. And I want to use that to illustrate, perhaps in a surprising or strange way, why you ought to care about operations, regardless of the area that you intend to specialize in. Vienna is a very old city, and in the past, in the fortification area of the Middle Ages, Vienna had a city wall that went all the way around it. In fact, let me draw a picture of this. The city wall was roughly round, and in times of conflict, when especially the long time conflict between Turkey and Vienna or the Austrian Empire, when in times of conflict, the people that lived outside of the city walls would come inside the city walls, and then they would attempt to withstand the enemy attacks within the fortifications, and the enemy would generally siege the city. So there were several sieges of Vienna, and it was often the Turkish Empire that was sieging Vienna. And they would go inside this particular round kind of city wall here, and then eventually the siege would be lifted and the Turks would leave. So in today's context, or in today's world, this wall no longer really exists. But what they've done in Vienna is they've created a very beautiful ring street that goes around the first district. So this area within Vienna is called the first district. And it's the very trendy area to live. It's very hip. There's lots of kind of interesting bars and restaurants and living areas there. And it's a really nice place to live. And it resides entirely within the old city walls that are now called the Ringstrasse. My German is okay, so I'll try to pronounce it as German. It's die Ringstrasse. And I think most Austrians, certainly the Viennese, would agree that the Ringstrasse is perhaps the most important historical street in all of Vienna. Now, why am I saying this? Well, because the Turks kept on invading and besieging the city of Vienna, there was a long-time relationship between these two cultures. And the Turks drank a lot of coffee, which was relatively unknown in Europe at that time. And ultimately, the Viennese absorbed that part of Turkish culture and became essentially the modern coffee capital of the world. If you had spoken to my parents' generation, so the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, where do you want to go for coffee culture? They would probably have said, let's go to a Viennese coffee house. And this is kind of associated with Vienna as one of the great coffee capitals of the world. Now, I find it strange when I visit Vienna, given that it's a coffee capital of the world, that as I'm walking around this very important street and I come to this intersection, there's a street called Kärntnerstrasse that roughly goes like this. It's called Kärntnerstrasse. And this is where, when the Holy Roman Emperor, so the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire later on, was crowned, he would take a procession through the city along this street. And this is often considered maybe the second most important street in the world. And as I said, if you walk around the Ringstrasse, something strange happens when you get to the northeast intersection of die Ringstrasse with Kärntnerstrasse. That is, right in this location, you find a giant Starbucks. And I find that an interesting question as to why in arguably the most historic, romantic coffee city in the Western world, you would go and then have Starbucks coffee. Why wouldn't you do what my parents would have done? Why wouldn't you do what I would have done, which is to seek out a true Viennese coffee house? Eat your Sachertorte, drink your coffee, and just enjoy looking out into the snow. And that brings up a question around branding. Starbucks is there principally because anybody from anywhere who has knowledge of the brand knows what to expect. Now, most people, let's not make it a generalization, let's say many people would argue that although Starbucks is good coffee, it's not great coffee. On a scale of 1 to 10, maybe it's arguable that Starbucks is an 8. But certainly if you spent time, you did your homework, and you did enough research, you could find one of those 9.5 or 10 coffee houses in Vienna. So why would you ever go to Starbucks instead of finding one of those coffee houses? And in this is the mystery of branding. I believe, and I think most of you would probably agree at some level, that I know what I'm going to get if I go to Starbucks. Whether I'm in Vienna, whether I'm in Austin, whether I'm in Houston, whether I'm in Beijing, whether I'm in Bangkok, I go into a Starbucks, I understand what's offered, I understand the consistency, I understand the quality, the baristas are going to treat me in a certain way. So it's a feeling of comfort and understanding of what you're going to get if you engage with that particular business. So that's why I think if you ever do visit Vienna and you come to this intersection and you go inside, you see not only American tourists, you see First District Viennese, you see tourists from other parts of the world, you see all sorts of people in here, and I think it has to do with the power of branding. So that leads to the question, what do we have to have in order to have a strongly branded product? Now, clearly, if the coffee was poor, or you couldn't count on its quality, or you didn't even like coffee, then none of this matters. But think for a moment what would happen if there was inconsistency of what Starbucks coffee tasted like. You went to Vienna and it tasted different and the interaction was different than going to Houston or going to Austin or going to Beijing, as I said. The problem you would have is that that would weaken, perhaps even eliminate, your ability to brand. The reason Starbucks can brand is because there is an absolute consistency of what they offer and you know what to expect. Did you ever stop to think about what does it take to make sure, I don't even know how many Starbucks there are, 25,000, 50,000 around the world? What does it take to have 25 or 50,000 different locations all have the same kinds of coffees, prepared in the same way, with the same kinds of cups and the same kind of barista training, the same kind of torts, the same kind of food? If you ever stop and think about that, you're starting to unravel a little bit of the mystery of operations. Operations is that strange part of business that it is doing best when it's noticed the least. So as long as operations is providing all the coffee, providing all the cups, training things, making sure people are there, staffing people at the right time, all of those kinds of issues, you almost don't even notice operations. You focus on coffee, you focus on what you think you're there to do, and operations blurs into the background. But as soon as operations makes a mistake, you start noticing it, and noticed operations is a bad operation. So think about that. It leads me to one more concept I'd like to talk to you about. In my view of the world, I like to think of business as a triangle. I think you'll find in your MBA program, everything's a 2x2 matrix or a triangle. Well, here's your first triangle from my class. I draw the picture like this. Even though I'm in the operations department, I am going to acknowledge and agree that at the peak of the triangle, the business triangle, is marketing. If you don't understand what product or services your customers want, and you can't deliver consistently what they're looking for, then the rest of the business model doesn't matter. You're not selling what they want, it's not going to work. So I have no problem putting marketing at the peak of the triangle. But I think there's two other fundamental areas that have to be considered. One is clearly finance. Let's call it finance and accounting, and I'll give you my opinion on that in a moment. The other is what I'm going to call operations. So, finance or accounting. Marketing is about understanding what the customer wants and getting a price that works for you. Whereas finance and accounting, they're scorekeeping. How well did I do? How much money did I make? And I think many people would agree with the statement. Finance is looking forward. Given what we know, what do I project into the future? whereas accounting is reporting what has happened. It's looking backwards in a sense and saying this is what has happened. But this is the scorekeeping side of things. It's what we're in business for. At the end of the day, we're not in business for marketing per se. We're in business for making money, the scorekeeping. But I think we can't forget this side, the operations side. Because if operations doesn't work correctly, then the scorekeeping is going to suffer or go away, and the marketing is not going to be able to consistently brand and deliver whatever's been offered. So in this course, my focus is not on operations by itself, but it's actually on this relationship between these three pillars of what happens in business. Now, if you're from a different functional area, I'm not trying to take anything away from you. What I'm trying to say from a business perspective is these are the three components that I tend to focus on in operations. If you now go back to the Ring Street and Kärtnerstrasse and the Starbucks, marketing has worked. Starbucks has branded. People understand Starbucks. They know what they're purchasing. It's been successful. The scorecard says Starbucks is doing pretty well. When we project forward, we understand what we think is going to happen in the future. We can raise money, issue debt, discuss business strategies, talk about franchising or keeping corporate-owned stores, but we understand the score of the game. But without operations, if the coffee isn't right, if it isn't delivered, if it isn't there, what happens is it becomes difficult to maintain your brand. Furthermore, it starts harming the score sheet. And that's what I want to look at in this course.